Hi, thanks for clicking on my video. This is going to be the first video in a video series that I'm going to be making on my theory, which is the Book of Mormon takes place entirely in the Old World. I call it the Old World Geographical Model. You can see here on the screen that the Book of Mormon took place entirely in the land here on the screen. And all the places are here, and there's an internal consistency with the Book of Mormon and these lands, and with the Bible. So, I'm going to be talking about this and where to begin. I discovered that right now today, faithful LDS members of the church are restoring a Phoenician ship across the river from Nauvoo. What in the world is going on here? I had to find out more about it. Where did this ship come from? What is the point? Here is Nauvoo, right here, north of St. Louis, and across the river is the Phoenician Ship Museum. You can visit it if you'd like. They are restoring a Phoenician ship which was built by a man named Philip Beale, and he built it according to the technology that the Phoenicians had in the year 600 BC. So, why are they excited about this? Why do they have the ship? Who is Philip Beale? How does this all come together? Here's the Wikipedia page on Philip Beale. He's a non-LDS sailor, and what he did in 2008 is he sailed around Africa. He circumnavigated Africa in a ship that he built to the standards the Phoenicians had in 600 BC. What really got the LDS community excited is that later, in 2019, he sailed from Africa to America in that same ship. And so after the expeditions, the ship was going to rot, I believe, and that's when it was purchased by the LDS. So you can see here's more information about his expeditions. The first one around Africa and the second one across the ocean to America. And then here, a little bit of info on the purchase of the ships by the LDS and the restoration of that ship in that museum across the river from Nauvoo. So, I'm so curious about this. Obviously, if a ship from 600 BC could make it across the ocean, then they are saying this is evidence that Lehi had the technology to make that journey. Clearly, this is long before Christopher Columbus, and most of the academic world does not believe that Jews sailed to America, but in the LDS community, we believe that it happened in 600 BC. So, looking into this further, I wanted to find out more about the details of this claim that Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa in 600 BC. Here is a YouTube search result showing a video that you can watch about ancient people sailing around Africa. That's going to give you some more information on that. And here, if you type in Philip Beale to YouTube, you'll see lots of videos about his expedition and interviews that he's done. Some of these interviews are with LDS and with the people who are restoring the ship there in Iowa. So, I discovered that the whole claim that Phoenicians sailed around Africa in 600 BC comes from Herodotus. Who is Herodotus? I didn't even know. I've learned that he is a Greek historian from the 5th century BC. So we're talking about, give or take, 100 years after Lehi. And he is, we call him the father of history. He's one of the first to really document a lot of histories. He traveled the world and he recorded the stories, the oral histories and traditions that he heard in these places that he traveled. He also created the first map of the world. And the whole point of my theory and what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be coming back to a lot of these points as I go throughout these videos, is that this is the first map of the world created by Herodotus. And you can see here, this is Africa, you have Arabia, and then, Asia and Europe. This map right here is basically the Book of Mormon map. When Book of Mormon writers and authors and prophets in the Book of Mormon, when they talk about the world, this is what they're talking about. We're talking about a time period before anybody sailed to America. America, the New World, was unknown, along with Australia and Antarctica, and this was their mindset. This was their mind frame of what the world looked like. And what we have here is the classic hourglass-shaped map that we are attempting to find somewhere in the New World. But we have it right here in the Herodotus first map of the world. The land south is Africa, the narrow neck of land is the Isthmus of Suez, and then the land north is everything else, which would be Asia and Europe combined, the landmass we call Eurasia. And so I'm going to be coming back to this map a few times throughout these video series to continue to make my point about how this is the Book of Mormon map. Now, of course, if you do a Google search for internal Book of Mormon maps, you come up with all these theories on the hourglass-shaped map that we know it has to be according to Alma 2232, which I'll get into in a moment. We have this hourglass-shaped map. The land south has to be surrounded by water. The land north is a little more ambiguous. We don't know where the top of it is, but we know there's a narrow neck of land in between. So we're looking for this all over. Some people think it's in Mesoamerica, the heartland, in between the Great Lakes, Panama, and what I have discovered is that it is actually the Old World. And when you think of it, you need to think of this map of the Old World. So, let's get into what Herodotus said. I've found Herodotus the Histories, Book 4. I'm going to start with Book 4, Chapter 40, Section 2. This is where I want to start reading. I'm going to read this, and then I'll come back to it and point out some of the relevant parts. Two quick things I want to say about this before we begin. First of all, when Herodotus says Libya, everyone has agreed that he is saying what we would say Africa. So he says Libya, he's talking about Africa, all of Africa. Another thing is that it doesn't specifically say that it was in 600 BC, but we can connect it to Lehi because of the pharaoh. We're going to talk about the pharaoh Necho, and we know that the pharaoh Necho is the pharaoh that killed King Josiah in the Bible. So we have that connection to 600 BC, and therefore we connect it directly to Lehi's time frame. So let me begin reading. I'm going to read it, and then I'll come back and go over some of the relevant parts. As far as India, Asia is an inhabited land, but thereafter all to the east is desolation, nor can anyone say what kind of land is there. Such is Asia and such its extent, but Libya is on the second peninsula, for Libya comes next after Egypt. The Egyptian part of this peninsula is narrow, for from our sea to the Red Sea it is a distance of 125 miles, that is 1,000 stades. But after this narrow part, the peninsula which is called Libya is very broad. I wonder then at those who have mapped out and divided the world into Libya, Asia, and Europe, for the difference between them is great, seeing that in length Europe stretches along both the others together, and it appears to me to be wider beyond all comparison. For Libya shows clearly that it is bounded by the sea, except where it borders on Asia. Nechos, king of Egypt, first discovered this and made it known. When he had finished digging the canal which leads from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, he sent Phoenicians in ships, instructing them to sail on their return voyage past the Pillars of Hercules until they came into the northern sea and so to Egypt. Okay, let's go back. Here we are. Herodotus, Book 4, Chapter 40, Section 2. I want to point out that he says Asia is inhabited, but thereafter all to the east is desolation. So we see this key word desolation. And he is making the connection to the east being desolation, specifically Asia. He says as far as India, Asia is inhabited, but thereafter all to the east is desolation. I've discovered one thing in reading a lot of these old texts, and it it is defined clearly in Helaman chapter 3, verse 6. The word desolation often refers to whether or not the land is inhabited or not. And so it's a direct relation to people living on the land. But here we have the word desolation, so that's a key word I want you to remember. In this next section, Book 441, Section 1, I want you to see that he says Libya is on the second peninsula. The Egyptian part of this peninsula is narrow. So here he's describing the Isthmus of Suez, the narrow part of Egypt. So that's the Isthmus of Suez, keyword narrow. Then he says, for from our sea to the Red Sea, it is the distance of 125 miles. So he's talking about our sea. Remember, he's from Greece. He's a Greek historian. So our sea is the Mediterranean to him. From the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, it is 125 miles. So he's describing the distance across the Isthmus of Suez as 125 miles. He's got that a little bit wrong. Wikipedia says that the Isthmus of Suez is 78 miles. So it's actually much less than he says here. And of course, he was writing things that he had heard. And of course, this is all before modern measurement technology. And so he says it's 125 miles. In this next section, he sets up the sailor. He says, I wonder who. So he's talking about who mapped it. Who mapped Africa? The answer is the sailor that he's going to talk about in the next section. Here he says, for Libya shows clearly that it is bounded by the sea, except where it borders on Asia. So what he's saying here is that Africa is surrounded by water, except the Isthmus of Suez, which connects to Asia. If it weren't for the Isthmus of Suez, Africa would be completely surrounded by water, and it would be an island. But because of the Isthmus of Suez, it is connected to Asia, and therefore not completely surrounded by water. But he says it is bounded by the sea, except the border of Asia. There's a lot more relevant things here. The Pharaoh Necho, I'm going to be talking about the Pharaoh Necho in a future video, and the canal. He says when they had finished digging the canal which leads from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, that canal is used in the Book of Mormon several locations as a geographical landmark, and I'm going to be making a future video on that and showing how that is talked about in the Book of Mormon. So, with those keywords in mind, I realized that what Herodotus says here is very similar to what we read in Alma 22:32. If you don't know, Alma 22:32 is used by many Book of Mormon geographical experts. They look at this as one of the key geographical verses in the Book of Mormon. And any theory that they come up with, whether it's in Mesoamerica or the Heartland or wherever they want to talk about their theory for where the Book of Mormon land is, they pretty much have to make sure that it conforms to this verse. This is one of the major ones. So let's read it, and then obviously I'm going to point out these keywords. And now it was only the distance of a day and a half's journey for a Nephite on the line Bountiful and the land Desolation, from the east to the west sea. And thus the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land between the land northward and the land southward. So this is again where we get that classic hourglass shape, where we know that there's a narrow neck of land, the land south is surrounded by water, the land north isn't defined as much, it's a little more ambiguous. And we get that internal map that so many people have, as I showed here. So clearly what we have here is a lot of similar key words in these two texts. Herodotus says that Egypt is narrow when he's talking about the Isthmus of Suez. And my theory is that the Book of Mormon says there being a small neck of land between the land north and the land south. That is describing the Isthmus of Suez. Herodotus says Asia is desolation. So, to the east is desolation. The Book of Mormon says on the line Bountiful and the land Desolation. So my theory is that the imaginary line at the Isthmus of Suez that separates the continents, Africa and Asia, that is the line Bountiful and the land Desolation. Asia is connected to Desolation. And Bountiful, my theory is that Bountiful is the Egypt, especially the fruitful Nile Delta in that context. I'm going to show that on my overall map. Then we have the distance. Herodotus says the distance across the Isthmus of Suez is 150 miles. We know it's about 78 miles. And the Book of Mormon also describes the distance across the narrow place. It says it's a day and a half journey of a Nephite on that line. Again, the line being the separation point between the two continents. We have the concept of sea to sea, our sea to the Red Sea. Herodotus says the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and the Book of Mormon says the East to the West Sea, so clearly those are the two seas. And we have the concept that Africa is bounded by the sea. That's what Herodotus says. Africa is bounded by the sea. That was the purpose of the sailing expedition that the Pharaoh sent the Phoenicians on. The purpose was to determine if Africa was surrounded by water, if it was a continent surrounded by the ocean, and if it could be sailed around. It wasn't mapped. Remember, Herodotus says, I wonder who mapped this. Africa at the time wasn't mapped. It was unknown if Africa could be sailed around. So Herodotus says Africa is clearly bounded by the sea. Book of Mormon says that the land south is surrounded by water. So both texts describe a sailor. Herodotus says a Phoenician was the sailor. Book of Mormon says the Lehites, Lehi, Nephi, the family, the Lehites were the sailors. We know it's the same time frame. We have a connection because Herodotus says it was the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the Book of Mormon says in 1 Nephi verse 2, the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, we see, Yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. So we have that connection to Egypt right out of the gate. Clearly, Lehi has a connection to Egypt. Many experts on the Book of Mormon and experts on Lehi have pointed that out before, that he had a connection to Egypt and that he probably did business in Egypt or was a trader and traded with Egypt, etc. So we have that concept. So we have that connection of the Egypt and the Egyptian language in the Book of Mormon, and then of course we have the location is the same location. Herodotus says it was Egypt and therefore close to the Red Sea. Egypt is right next to the Red Sea. And the Book of Mormon says that Lehi started in Jerusalem and then came down to the Red Sea. So we're talking about the same part of the world. We're not talking, it's not like Herodotus said Genghis Khan sent sailors into the China Sea. We're talking about the same part of the world. Okay. I know a big question I'm going to get is, Herodotus said that the sailor was a Phoenician, and we know that Lehi was a Jew. So why are you saying that this could be the same person? Well, I have a couple of reasons for that. Number one, when Herodotus wrote his history, the Jews were in bondage in Babylon. And for that reason, Herodotus never mentions Jews specifically. So it doesn't seem crazy to me that if he's living 100 or so years after Lehi and he's hearing the story of the sailor Lehi who sailed around Africa on the orders of the Pharaoh, it's not crazy at all that he would call a Jew a Phoenician. Phoenicians and Jews come from the same area of the world, and of course Phoenicians are very famous for their sailing and their sailing skill, and the Book of Mormon tells us that Lehi was a sailor. So we have that seems very logical to me that Herodotus could have heard the story of Lehi circumnavigating Africa and called him a Phoenician. The second reason is Herodotus here in Book 4, Chapter 39, Section 2, he describes the Middle East. And I'll read it. Now from the Persian country to Phoenicia there is a wide and vast tract of land, and from Phoenicia this peninsula runs beside our sea by way of the Syrian, Palestine, and Egypt, which is at the end of it. In this peninsula there are just 3 nations. So he describes the Middle East, and he says between Persia and Egypt there are just 3 nations. Those nations are Phoenicia, Syria, and Palestine. So we look at this map of the ancient Near East in 540 BC. This is about the same time frame. And so we kind of see the Persian empires over here, the Egyptian empires over here, and of course Herodotus is describing the land in between. And he says there's just 3 nations in between: Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine. He does not say anything about Jews or Hebrews or Jerusalem. So it seems logical that Herodotus could have been describing Lehi. I did a Google search and I found this: Herodotus was unaware of the Jewish culture. So I can leave this link in here. This is just kind of the things you'll find if you want to start looking into why Herodotus didn't talk about Jews, as I've been describing. So that's my first video. Thanks for watching my first video. In my next video, I'm going to be going into Lehi in the wilderness. I'm going to be presenting that map of Lehi in the wilderness, and I'm going to be giving a new perspective on Lehi in the wilderness. I do not think he went into Arabia. I think he came down to Egypt, and the rest of his journey was in Africa. And the rest of the Book of Mormon takes place in Africa. And I'm going to be showing that over the course of these next videos that I'm going to be making. So it's going to be exciting. I hope you come along, and I hope you interact with me in the comment section. Please tell me why you think I'm right. Tell me why you think I'm crazy or wrong. I've been thinking about this for many years, and I've had a lot of criticism already, and I've been able to work through a lot of that criticism and discover that my theory tends to hold up pretty strong, stronger than the other theories that I have been studying. So it's exciting. I hope you enjoyed this video. Interact with me in the comment section and stay tuned for my next video. Thanks.